All right. So it's recording now.
Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to work with us.
My pleasure.
Okay, so we have a few questions that we made. We want to ask you about the Harlem
Okay.
Hellfighters. Yep.
All right. Shoot.
Okay, I'll begin. The first question is, what was life like for Blacks in the United States before and during World War One?
What was life like for Black people during World War One?
Yes, sir.
All right. Not great. It was a very special time for African Americans because it was something called the Great Migration. I don't know if you've learned about that yet.
Yes, sir.
Basically, what happened was it was a time when America was building a lot of factories and starting to make stuff, and it was all sort of in the North and in the Midwest. And it and those factories needed workers. They needed a lot of people to come here and work these factories, and so they encouraged a lot of people to come from Eastern Europe and also from the South. Millions of Black Americans who had been working as sharecroppers down in the South migrated to the North. And those Black Americans migrating to the North learned a very harsh lesson, which is Northern white people could be just as racist as Southern white people. And that's when a lot of really bad race riots started. And a lot of it was mixed with had to do a lot with labor. It had to do a lot with jobs because, and this is something very important, that race, the idea of people being divided into races, a lot of that is an invention of rich people to divide up poor people. Because the idea is if poor people suddenly realize that they're all the same, they'll gang up on the rich people. So the rich people were like, oh, what do we do? Well, and we'll divide up the poor people. Right. And so as African Americans came to northern cities, were living there, were scared and angry and ignorant, and a lot of violence happened. Horrible, horrible violence. So yeah, it was not a great time. In some ways, it was a great time because the African American community really started to build a middle class. And of those workers that were coming there, you started to get educated, large groups of young, educated African Americans. You started to get organizations like the NAACP that had been there for a while, but were really starting to take off. You started to get newspapers like The Crisis, which were devoted specifically to the African American community, which also meant African Americans were starting to read in large numbers. So it wasn't just about groups of people. It was also about power, the power of education and the power of politics, voting, making your voice known. So in that way, it was good. But you could definitely say that this was a huge time of change.
Okay, thank you. And for the second question, could you tell us who were the Harlem Hellfighters?
All right, the Harlem Hellfighters were a unit of New York National Guardsmen. Because when the U.S. Army went to war in World War One, they had regular army and also National Guard. And the difference is the regular army is put together by the whole country, the federal government. So it doesn't matter where you come from, you're all in one group called the Army. But the National Guard is put together by states. So it's like every state has its own little army. And so the New York National Guard had a group of soldiers that were African American. That was the Harlem Hellfighters. And so they fought for the United States in World War One.
Okay. What was it like for Black soldiers during the years of the World War One, and was it different for the Harlem Hellfighters?
You know, it was very different because what was hard on the Harlem Hellfighters was they were set up by their own government to fail because the government, the people in power, were very, very scared. They actually, the government walked themselves into a trap because it's World War One. Why are you going to fight World War One? Why does America need to go over to Europe and get shot and bloodied for Europeans? You know why? For their wine and cheese? No. So the American president Woodrow Wilson came up with this great idea. We're going to make the world safe for democracy. America is going to fight for a better world and equality and freedom. Yay. The problem is, then those white men who came up with this awesome idea sat down and realized, that also means Black Americans. Because if Black Americans sign up to fight for freedom and liberty and equality and all that good stuff, and they go overseas to France and they fight for that, they're going to come home and demand that same democracy here.
Right.
We better make sure that does not happen. So the government and even the army tried to get in the way of their own soldiers. They tried to get in the way of the Harlem Hellfighters to make sure that these guys did not go over to France and come home as heroes. Because that was what's so dangerous. You know, as young people, the best thing to realize your dreams is to see other people realize it before you. Whatever you want to do with your life, if you've seen someone go out and do it, you realize it can be done. And what the American government did not want was African Americans of your age group looking at these soldiers and saying, wow, I can do that too. I can fight for something bigger and better. I can fight for a better world because it can be done. And so they tried to get in their way. So unlike the white soldiers who only had to fight the Germans, the Black soldiers had to deal with the Germans on one side and their own government on the other side. So they were fighting a two-front war.
Okay, so for the fourth question, why do you think Black soldiers, including the Harlem Hellfighters, were willing to fight for a country that despised them?
You know why? Because they understood that the country wasn't just white. They were Americans too. And they were fighting for their right to be counted as Americans because they appreciated what democracy actually meant. You know, to a lot of the white soldiers who grew, you know, when you grow up with something, you take it for granted. And I encourage you all to turn to your parents and say, what do I take for granted? And trust me, your parents have a long list. Now, when you grow up without something, you appreciate it. You appreciate what it means. And so if you're white and you grow up in America in 1917, you grew up with the right to vote, the right to be treated as an American, all these privileges. So when someone says we need to fight for democracy, it's like, yeah, okay, but I'm not really sure what that means. When you grow up Black in 1917, democracy is something you don't have. So you're actually fighting for something. And you could actually argue that in not just in America, but in the entire world, in World War I, all these different countries, Germany, France, Britain, the Turks, the Austrians, the Russians, the Italians, everybody was fighting, but nobody knew what they were fighting for. If you had asked the average soldier, if you could walk around the battlefields of World War I and say to any soldier, what are you fighting for? Most of them would say, I don't know. But if you asked a Black American soldier, what are you fighting for? They'd say, I know exactly what I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for the right to be an American. And you could argue that the Black soldiers in World War I were the only soldiers fighting for something in a war about nothing. So that's why they were doing it. They were fighting to prove their rights.
Okay. The next question is, how did they get their name, the Harlem Hellfighters?
The Harlem Hellfighters were given to them by the Germans because the Germans were terrified of them. Because when they went up against them, the Harlem Hellfighters were magnificent warriors.